Hello, everybody, and good morning. My name is Erica, and I'm a board member of ELSA Sweden. And I just want to give a quick introduction to our following lecture given by Jonas Kyronvita. But first, I also want to express our huge gratitude to ELSA Germany for inviting ELSA Sweden to participate in this amazing initiative. And secondly, also a big thank you to you, Jonas, for accepting our invitation to give a lecture on this topic. So in the following hour, you will be able to listen to a lecture by Jonas, who is a Juris Doctorate candidate at the Law Department of the University of Gothenburg. He specializes in sustainable development, maritime law, and environmental law, with a focus on aquaculture systems. He will be discussing the Sustainable Development Goal number 6, clean water and sanitation for all, with a focus on the target 6.4 that regards sustainable water usage and the supply of fresh water. We'll also touch on the topic of EU water legislation. If you have any questions, please feel free to write them in the YouTube or in the Slido, and I will keep track of it and read them out loud to Jonas. And so it will be a bit more interactive. So any questions, please write them in and I will keep track of it. And that's all. So I'll give the word over to you now, Jonas.
Thank you, Ilka. This is so cool. This is a really cool event. I'm really happy to be a part of it. I hope no one has been up since 5 o'clock yesterday and listened to all of these presentations. I think most of them will be available on YouTube. And if you have been up since 5 o'clock yesterday, take a nap now and watch this later. We're going to talk about water today. It's the SDG number 6. There are another one also on water. I think it's 14. But we're going to focus on number 6. And my thought on this is that I'll start really broad. I'm going to start really on since the beginning on sustainable development, and then work my way down to this specific goal, and then also look at the European Union legislation. So we're going to start really from, well, kind of the beginning, or at the turn of the century, at least. This is Trail. I would guess no one has been to Trail, but Trail is in the southwest of Canada, in British Columbia. And they had an industry where they melted together different kind of metals. And this was a hugely successful industry. They made a lot of money, and they kind of built this town around this industry. Pretty much everyone who worked there were either in the industry or working with agriculture or infrastructure and those kinds of things. So it was kind of just this industry. And they used to say, when the smoke was heavy and black, then we knew that it was successful. We're going to make money. We have a job the next day. And believe it or not, this is kind of where international environmental law started around 100 years ago. Because this heavy smoke, the agriculture around the industry noticed that, well, we are really happy because of the heavy smoke. People have work, they have money, and they can buy our products. But this heavy smoke also means that we can't grow our products. So they went to the industry and asked, okay, we have to solve this somehow. Can we find a solution to this that both you and I can exist at the same time? Said and done, they found a solution. They built up the chimneys. So the smoke just disappeared and didn't come back. But they solved it for themselves. Later on, in the northwest of the US, they noticed that, well, now we have a heavy smoke coming in. There's some grease on our plants, and we can't build this. We can't use this land at all. So this turned into an international conflict. And what they did in the end, they created a tribunal. They solved it with different kinds of judges. But this kind of started this whole international environmental law, since they noticed that, well, what you do on your land, it's going to affect us. And that is true for the smoke. And it's true also for the water that we're going to talk about today. And that's initiated the global and environmental discipline, where in the end of the 60s, Sweden and a couple of different countries went to the UN and said, we need to discuss this amongst each other. So they did a conference in 1972 in Stockholm, where they discussed environmental issues. But at the same time, they needed to discuss development issues as well, since especially Europe had colonies for a long time. They have used others' resources, and we have a lot of developing countries. And the question was, well, you have done this, you have taken our resources, you have had these industries for a long time. What should we do and what should you do? We have a different responsibility to these issues. So to solve the environmental issues, we also have to solve the development issues, which is with each other. And that was the topic of this conference. Nothing really concrete came out of it. We have the Stockholm Declaration with different environmental principles, but no hard law to go. But we have started to discuss this issue, and 10 years later, the UN General Assembly decided to, well, we need to discuss these issues again. We have gotten some hard law out of this, but we have to take like this total concept of what is the development going to be? What is the environment going to be for the year 2000? So they sent this mission to find out how are we going to do this to the woman on the right, Gro Harlem Brundtland, a Norwegian. She was prime minister and environmental minister at times. She has been called the most powerful woman in Scandinavia. So she started this commission, usually called the Brundtland Commission. And 5 years later, they came back with this Our Common Future, where they said, well, it's not a different crisis. The energy crisis we have, the oil crisis, development crisis, the environmental crisis, they are not different. They are all the same. And we have to make sure that the development we have today does not compromise the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. So we have to consider, when we consider environmental issues, we also have to consider development issues, but at the same time, the other way around, and we can find solutions between these two. So they took this to the Rio conference in 1992. We have 172 participant countries. It's around 50, 60 more than in Stockholm 1972. And we start to get more hard law out of this, actual regulation. We have a new declaration. We have Agenda 21. It's not as popular today, but the meaning of it was to create these local communities where they discuss sustainable development. And then also we get different kind of climate conventions and conventions on biological diversity. And then they've been following this up with different conferences, and they're getting more and more popular among politicians, celebrities, but also among regular people. So we lifted this question up to a whole new level. And shortly to recap, this is the environmental sustainability, the one of three dimensions where we talk about ecological resources. And the important thing here is to notice that they are resources. They are from an anthropocentric point of view, where we look at what does it mean to the human race, pretty much, not that they have intrinsic value of itself. So this is the perspective of the sustainable development theory, where it's about survival and thrival. But it doesn't mean that we don't appreciate clean water, for example. It's, of course, very, very important in many ways. Let's see. Now I can't change the slide, unfortunately. There we go. Then we have the next dimension, the social sustainability, where we instead look at the other way around. Instead of looking at how much resources we have, we look at, okay, what do we have to cover with these resources, where we look to cater to all individual needs. This is, of course, health, justice, poverty. A lot of the things we are talking about today with human rights. And this is going to mean different things in different parts of the world, which is also what they have put in now with the new SDGs, that you also are able to put in individual needs based on what country you are. Because all culture aren't the same, all needs aren't the same. What we need to thrive is not the same thing. But this is to ensure equality among the different people. And the last one is the economic dimension, economic sustainability. Before we talked about sustainable development, we had this idea that economic growth was the thing to do to actually thrive, to make sure that developing countries do develop. Because we noticed that, okay, if people don't have enough resources, we have to produce more and more and more resources, create economic growth, and that way we can take everyone out of poverty. What we did notice after a while was that, yeah, that is a good idea in theory. But what we have here is we have resources to actually consider. They are limited. So we can't create economic growth just continually without thinking about the resources. What we do now is we try to create economic growth as much as possible within our given resources. So, for example, circular economy is a typical thing where you try to use the same resource over and over and over again to create growth, so you don't have to take new resources. So what we look at here is, well, for example, consumption. What kind of consumption do we have? What kind of recycling are we able to do? The financial regulation, all these different things create sustainable development. And what we can see here is that we create these synergies. If we can solve the ecological sustainability, for example, where we have control over ecological resources, well, then we are probably going to help us to create social sustainability as well, because we live within our means. And the same thing with economic sustainability. And they kind of affect each other in a way. And what we need to do in real life is to establish mechanisms on global, national, and local levels. Some environmental problems, for example, they are local problems. And those problems are solved locally. Some are bigger, they're national or regional, and we look at those on that level. But some issues we have to handle globally. We are so interconnected to one another that we take it to a global level. For example, climate change, such a global issue where one country can't do all to solve this, but they are going to be affected either way. They can't solve climate crisis for their own nation. We have to do it together globally. And for that, we use these different kind of dimensions to create a change. And this is also seen in the report, Our Common Future, that we look at, okay, what is the issue? Well, it's the intergenerational issue where we are currently using more resources than one another, or future generations are going to be able to use. This issue is really dependent on the distribution of power and influence, where we see that in the world, some have a lot of power, some have very little power and influence, and that is going to create a huge problem, because these differences create not only problems for social sustainability, but that is also the main environmental problem. So we aren't talking about different issues, we are talking about one and the same issue. So how do we work with sustainability, or how do we evaluate sustainability? Well, it's really about the system's ability to achieve set goals. So we set our goals. What are our goals? Environmental goals, social goals. We want to eradicate poverty. Do we have a system in place to do this? And this can be legal systems, of course, that we all work with, but it can also be social systems, it can be knowledge systems, it can, of course, be economic systems, and all of these work in different ways. And they have to be effective. And one solution is perhaps not the same solution for all. If you look at healthcare, for example, well, you can see in the European Union, usually we have a lot of state-controlled healthcare, where we make sure that everybody has access to healthcare. And by that way, we can ensure health. But in other countries, we can see that that's a civil issue, where it's companies that sell a product and you have insurance, and that insurance is usually connected to your employment. And through that, without this governance control, you can perhaps also achieve healthcare. And there's pros and cons with all of these systems. For healthcare, for example, if it's government controlled, well, usually you reach a minimum level for everyone. While if you have it more corporate controlled, you have usually a kind of effective system, innovative systems, but perhaps not coverage for all in the same way, because we don't have this state that is responsible for all of this. But then we also have to look at the relation between the different units, which means, okay, we have achieved healthcare. Has that helped us with the ecological sustainability as well? Or does that take a huge toll on the environment? So we can't have different systems that don't connect to one another. We also have to worry about, okay, what does this do for us in achieving the different goals? So we have to have an interconnected system that works with one another. So that is what we have to think about as well. And to do this, to set these goals and to make sure we have systems in place to reach these goals, the first thing we have to do is to actually set the goals. And of course, achieving sustainability is a goal in itself, but it's really hard to measure. And what does it mean? And how do we achieve that huge goal? It's too big. So what they did for the millennium, they took 8 goals. And these were the most burning questions that we as a society, we have lived so long, and we have this global community that they decided we can't let this go on. We have to solve these 8 problems. So they set up these 8 goals. These were mostly for developing countries to make sure and this put in a system to actually solve this together. So they set 8 goals. They have different targets, which means that, okay, we have this big goal of eradicate extreme poverty and hunger. What are our targets within that goal? Something more concrete. And then we have indicators, which mean that we can actually measure this. So we started at this point and then we moved over here. So we actually have some kind of development. And that helps us also when we put pressure. If we say, oh, we did everything, we have put in very fine goals, objectives to reach, well, somehow we also must make sure that we also reach them so we can put pressure on politicians. So these ended in 2015, as probably most of you know. And what we could see was that we took huge strides in many of these issues. So they were highly successful. It doesn't mean that everything was solved and everyone lived happily, but many of the most urgent problems were not solved, but at least we made strides there. And in 2015, we started with the SDGs, and these are different from the Millennium Goals. The Millennium Goals were urgent problems. There were these few problems that we needed to work on right now. For the SDGs, we took this total point of view on these and decided that this these 17 goals kind of make up all of sustainable development. They are not only for developing countries, but for all countries to achieve, and we have to work on these together. And they are very different issues, of course, but what you can see when you go down to the targets is that they connect to one another. If you look at gender equality, for example, well, of course, reach gender equality when it comes to power and influence, very important, but also when it comes to these economic mechanisms. For example, agriculture, can you own agriculture? Can you run agriculture and make sure that we have equality in that kind of issue as well? So we connect economic issues, environmental issues with these social issues and see, okay, we have these holistic views. And then they also connect these different goals to one another. So if we talk about the water, for example, water is an issue that comes over and over again in these different goals. So this is kind of the picture I think everyone has seen. This is kind of common, but what it really looks like is perhaps better represented in this, because here you can see all of these SDGs, but you can also see the targets, and there are different amounts of targets depending on what kind of issue it is. And then we see all of these targets, and then we have these indicators. And we are going to focus on goal number 6 and look at the targets for goal number 6, and then also on the indicators, and then dive in to a certain target, to a certain indicator, and then try to see how the European Union has solved this. Erika, do we have any questions so far? Or are we good? No questions so far. Okay, good. I think everything is crystal clear then. Then we can dive in, because this is what goal 6 looks like if you look at the target, and we have different kinds of issues in this. And it says by 2030, achieve universal and equitable access to safe and affordable drinking water for all. And drinking water is an urgent issue in many parts of the world. And then we can also see that drinking water is one of the issues when we look at water. Water is a lot of different things. It's recreation, it's sanitation, it's industry for many, it's fishing, it's production of different kinds of products. So water means a lot of things. Drinking water is one, and then the one that is probably very urgent right now and has been up in media and also in your lives is sanitation. Clean water for sanitation is so important for everyone to keep the health, to have a longer age. And of course, nowadays also for COVID, that you have clean water and don't. Sorry, I got a message here. And then what I'm going to look at is pollution. How do we reduce pollution? How do we eliminate dumping and minimize release of hazardous chemicals? Because water is, of course, flowing. So if one country or one region or one city dumps things, pollutes, well, the water is not going to stay there. It's going to flow in rivers and it's going to go up and then rain down again. And what we can see is that these chemicals, these substances, actually appear in different parts of the world. So it could be a very local issue, but it's also going to be a regional, national, and global issue in the end. And that is also important for future generations, because what we've noticed now is that we have polluted the water so much that it's not resilient. It can't actually go back to what it was, and everything we dump in is going to build and build and build and build. So when we leave this world to the next generation, well, they're going to have water that is very polluted. And that is going to hinder them, of course, from producing their products, to have sanitation, to have drinking water. So these are urgent issues to deal with. So if we look at target 6.3 in this case, we have by 2030, 2030 is of course the end goal for all of these SDGs, improve water quality by reducing pollution, eliminate dumping, and minimizing release of hazardous chemicals and materials, halving the proportion of untreated wastewater and substantially increasing recycling and safe reuse globally. So it's now we have taken this issue of water and focused it on, okay, this is pollution. We have to reduce the pollution from different kinds of sources. So now we have something we can actually work with. We can actually, okay, this is what I can see. We have gone from, okay, achieving sustainable development to achieving clean water and sanitation to actually, okay, reduction of pollution is the big thing. So now we have to measure this. And they have put up indicators to actually do the measuring. And here we see that proportion of wastewater, and wastewater is one of the biggest pollutants, of course. And what it actually is, it has a lot of nutrients mainly, but it can also be industrial wastewater with different kinds of chemical substances, and that is released into water many times without filtration. So the first thing you want to do is probably put some kind of filtration to it. And then in the next step, you will actually want to see, okay, how can we reuse the water? How can we use this resource over and over and over again without having to put it back into nature as a wastewater? And then the next indicator, and the indicator I think I will look into further, is the proportion of bodies of water with good ambient water quality. And what that means is that you measure the water quality in different kinds of water. So you can go to a lake, you take up some water and you test it in a laboratory, and you can see what kind of chemical substances do we have here. Do we have wastewater, too much nutrients? Are the fish happy? Are the algae happy? So is this usually what you want to measure against is the natural state of water. So if we didn't have any human interaction with the water, what would it look like, and what is the closest thing we can expect to get back to? Because the issue is, if we actually pollute, it's going to just go on and go on and go on and go on. What we want to do is pollute so little that it actually is resilient to go back to its natural state over and over. And this is, of course, an ecosystem as well. It's not only that, oh, it's going to be polluted, but it's going to affect everyone who lives off that water, not only humans, but all the fish, all the animals, all the plants. And that is going to make changes that is way bigger than this lake, for example. So that is an issue that is going to go on and on. And in the end, actually be an issue for us going on in entirely different areas than just the use of water. So this is the interconnected goals coming in. We have to solve the water issue to actually be able to live sustainable, also in social issues, economic issues, not only just because we want to have nice lakes. And this issue of sustainable development, it has been in the EU for around 25 years now, where they put it in the Treaty of the European Union as a main objective of the European Union. The European Union started off as a trade union, of course. We have a lot of economic incentives. So we wanted to take away all the trade barriers. What we noticed after a while working with this union is that, well, we can use this trade as something more, because every time we work with money and there's a value in it, we can put in demands as well. So we start to work with different kinds of social demands on the products that we trade with, and then also the environmental demands on them. So if we control the money, we can control different things as well. That is the center of our society. And in the 90s, we decided to also put in sustainable development as a goal in itself. So it says that the union shall establish an internal market. It shall work for the sustainable development of Europe based on balanced economic growth and price stability. Of course, a very economic dimension of this, a highly competitive social market economy aiming at full employment and social progress. We have social sustainability worked into this, and then also a high level of protection and improvement of the quality of the environment. It shall promote scientific and technological advance. So now it's not only the goal of the European Union to take away these trade barriers and in itself keep peace, but now also to take on different kinds of issues. We have so much power and influence within this union, but also outside this union, that we can actually make things work. And what we noticed that, especially the last couple of years, is that we have taken more and more progressive steps to actually enforce this in a very clear way. And we can also see that that has led to progress. And this has resulted in different kinds of water legislation in the European Union. And these are all very, very different and different mechanisms in work. But if we look at water out of a perspective, this is just examples. Here I took six examples I could pick at the top of my mind, but there's a lot of directives and also regulations in work here. And one of the issues we discussed earlier is, of course, the wastewater. So they initiated almost 30 years ago the Urban Wastewater Directive, which is also, of course, connected to Drinking Water Directive. And I'm not going to dive into those much further. What I'm going to look at during the rest of this lecture is the Water Framework Directive. And the Water Framework Directive is to ensure this quality of water that we discussed earlier, to make sure that we have this good quality in the lake. So we go actually to our waters and test it and see the status of the water and see if we can make progress to that. Then there's also a directive for bathing water. And the last couple of years, especially the last 15 years, we have looked a lot on the marine resources. If we look at the European Union, there's a lot of marine resources connected to it. And also they have this exclusive competence, for example, for fishing. So whatever we can fish within the European Union, that is regulated by the European Union. And one of the issues they've worked with a lot the last couple of years is to enforce this kind of blue growth. We have so many marine resources and we can use them much, much more. So instead of using other resources that we have overused for a long time, we can instead move that to a marine area. So in 2008, they put in this Marine Strategy Framework Directive. It works very closely to the Water Framework Directive that we are going to look at a little bit later. But that is to ensure the quality of the marine waters. It's not as enforceable since the marine areas are so big that we can't really use it in individual projects the same way. And then they have started to use this Maritime Spatial Planning Directive, which means that, okay, we have these marine areas. What we want to do is to start planning how we use them, not just put this there and this here, but just like we do on land, where we have planning to ensure that we maximize the resource of lands. The same thing we are now doing with our marine resources. And this is, of course, connected then to the blue growth, which means that we are going to use this much, much more for energy, for food, for transportation that we aren't using today. But I want to look into the Water Framework Directive a little bit more. And the objective of this is to establish a legal framework for the protection, ecological enhancement, and restoration of our rivers, streams, lakes, wetlands, and transitional and coastal waters. So that's a lot of waters. The only thing they have excluded is the marine waters that we discussed earlier, except for the coastal waters. So all of the inland waters we have, usually freshwater, and then the coastal waters, that is in the Water Framework Directive. That is what we want to establish a legal framework for. And what we want to achieve is what they call good status for all water bodies by 2015. Well, we passed 2015, and I can say we haven't reached good status for all the water bodies yet. But for some of them, we can move that date to a later cycle, as they call, because they worked on this in 6-year cycles. And that is either in 2021, if there's reason to believe that we need the time to do this for 2021, or by 2027 at the latest. So by 2027, the objective is to have all water bodies in the European Union to reach good status. I can tell you already, we are not going to reach good status by 2027, but what we can see is that we are making progress. And what is good status? How can we even measure that? That is, again, it sounds very good, it's an objective, but to actually measure this, to actually know what we are going to achieve, we have to break it down. So for all water bodies, we have this chemical status. And what they are doing, they test the water and they are looking for these hazardous chemicals and substances that usually are man-made, that are not supposed to be in the nature. And for a long, long time, we have used these kinds of chemicals. Usually the most effective chemicals are also the most hazardous. So, for example, if you want to paint your boat, you use anti-fouling paint. And for a long time, we used something called tributyltin, or TBT. And it was so effective as a paint for your boat. And everything that tried to attach to the boat, it died. And at the time, they believed that it was actually environmentally good. We don't have any problems with this. It didn't take long for them to see that the effects of this TBT paint was actually that we had imposex among animals in the waters. Everything died. It was also cancerogenous, mutagenous, the most hazardous chemical probably the human race ever released into nature voluntarily. And that is one of the chemicals that they actually measure. And we stopped using that in the early 80s. Still today, we can see that we have very high levels of TBT in certain waters because the half-life is very long. So the chemical status must be good. We have to have very low minimal levels of these chemicals listed. And then for most waters, they also look at the ecological status. So we look away from the hazardous chemicals and instead look at different kind of biological values. That can be how many fish do we have, how many of these plants do we have, how much nutrients do we have in the water. You don't want to have eutrophication in water. So if you have too much nutrients, it's going to grow on the surface of the water, and you're going to have just death in the bottom. So they put up different kinds of elements you measure, and to make sure that, okay, if we reach all of these elements, then we can reach a good status. For groundwater, we have quantitative status. It's how much water we have in the ground. And if we have artificial or heavily modified water bodies, we are never going to get to this natural state. Everything is to be so close to the natural state of water. If we didn't have humans there, that is not possible for certain water bodies, either because they are man-made. We have actually made them ourselves, so there is no natural state of this water, but it's made by us. So the natural state would be that it wouldn't be there. So they call that ecological potential. Some water bodies are so heavily modified that we are never going to put it into a natural state as well. So those have different kind of elements in this. So we have all of these different measurements for this, and if we reach at least good on every single one of those, then we have good status for the water body. And if you have reached good status, or if you even reached high status, that is not allowed to go down. So you can't go from good status to moderate status. You can't go from high status to good status. That is the non-deterioration principle. So we aren't allowed to go back in time for this. So once you reached it, it has to stay that way. And then the question is, how do we actually reach this? Well, what they did was to put in plans. So for each water body, you have to have a program of action. So they put these in what we call river basins. That's kind of an ecosystem approach where you try to limit this river basin based on what is the ecosystem that it actually supports, how is it connected. And you put the objectives for each water body. What kind of elements do we have to reach? What is the natural state? And if the natural state, well, very close to it, it's high, and then kind of close to it, it's good, then moderate and bad. So you put that to each and every water body. I think in Sweden it's around 25,000 different water bodies. So it's huge work with this. And then you put in a program of action. So how can we reach this? Not only, okay, we're going to stop to pollute, but in some instances, we actually have to take action to reach this objective by the time limit. And then you renew this every 6 years. And what you have to do for each water body is each member state have to send these to the Commission, and they have to say, okay, that is a reasonable amount of action you have taken to either reach it by this time, or it's reasonable based on what we can expect you to actually do during this time. And then you have to approve these action plans. And then this goes in cycles. So you have to have new action plans every 6 years. That's why it was 2015 was the first year when you could reach it. If you can't reach it by 2015, then by the second cycle, which is 2021, or 2027, which is the last cycle where you actually have to reach the good status. So that is the big plan for each and every water body. But then is also the question, okay, how does this affect individual permitting processes? I want to start this industry, or I want to start my aquaculture production, fish farming. That is going to have an effect on the water body. And in the Weser case, which came in, I think the decision was actually in 2015, if I'm not wrong. And Weser is a river in Germany, as many of you know. And a German court sent this question to the European Union court, asking, how does this affect the individual permitting process? If one permitting process, it's potentially gonna affect the status of this water body, does that actually mean that we can't approve this permit, that we actually can't do those actions based on this one individual project? In this case, it was actually to deepen a river to make sure that we can come with larger vessels through that river, and that is going to have a huge effect on some of the elements there. And then they also noticed that, well, it's probably not going to affect the entire status, but it's going to affect some of the elements. So it's still going to be this moderate status, but some of the good elements are going to go from good, moderate, or from high to good. So it's going to affect different elements. So for example, how many fish do we have of this type? Well, that is a biological element that makes up this good status. And the court came back and said that, well, you are not allowed to approve a project that is going to affect the status. This is on individual project basis. So if there's a risk that this would actually affect the status, well, then you are not allowed to do it. It's not enough to have this river basin management plan, this overall plan, but that is also on this individual level. And then they also said, well, you're not allowed, the non-deterioration principle also affects each and every element. So for example, if you have this amount of fish and then you're gonna have a little bit less fish in the river later, and that it's gonna go from a good status to moderate status for that element, you're not allowed to do that either. So they are very strict on this to make sure that we can actually reach this by 2015, 2021, or 2027. So this is a very strict principle to reach this goal, and in the end also reach the Sustainable Development Goals. This was not in place when this Water Framework Directive is, but now it's connected to one another. So what we see is that we have this very comprehensive, strict, enforced water legislation in the European Union, and that does make progress for water in our union. But the questions that I work with, and I think is very interesting here, is, well, we have a system in place to make sure that we have very good water quality. Does that equal that we are reaching sustainable development? Well, what you have to look at is these different objectives and how they connect to one another. Water is one of them, but as we said earlier, we use our water to very many things, and a lot of it is productions, different kinds of industries. So if we forbid that industry, what happens to that industry? I work with food, I work with fish farming, and what we noticed around the union is now that they have rejected a lot of the permits. But we're still gonna eat, right? So what does happen then? Well, perhaps we try to eat something else. We use something from agriculture or from fishing. There is a problem with that as well. We have overfished our marine resources. Agriculture actually adds a lot of nutrients and has effect on our land resources. So that is perhaps not the best solution either, but we still must have food. One of the possible solutions is that we produce it somewhere else. We move it outside the union, but that is not a solution for the problem either. That actually just moves the problem. It moves it usually to China, where they have this huge aquaculture production. So what we have to find is solutions to make sure that we have cleaner production, that we can move this incentive to actually get people to use clean production methods, sustainable production methods, and make sure that we have this very strict and good water legislation is just one step. But then to actually solve the problems, we have to make sure that it's also economic sustainability for the farmers, for people, and also socially sustainable to make sure that everyone has something to eat. So this is a complex problem, but I hope I have given you some insight to the water legislation in the European Union and SDG 6. So, Elke, do we have any questions? Oh, hi.
Hello. Yes, we actually received a couple of questions. I'm not sure if we will have time for all of them, but we'll do our best. And we're gonna get the questions up here as well, so everybody can read them. So I was looking through them earlier, and we can maybe comprise some of them into each other. So we have one question regarding that you said that the good status would not be achieved by 2027 for most water bodies in the EU. Like when do you think?
For all of them. I'm not going to say most.
For all of them, okay. When do you think that it would be possible to actually achieve that status?
For some of them, I think that's going to be for a long, long time. They are so heavily polluted. And also some of the chemical substances, for example, they have such a long half-time, which means they don't disappear. So in some cases, we have exceptions to just because we can't actually reach them. So for some of them, it's going to take a long, long time. What we have a huge issue with right now is coastal waters, for example. And coastal waters, they are not that isolated either. So no matter how much you work with the coastal waters and the river basins connected to that, it's going to be affected by different waters from different kinds of different places of the world. So that might actually be very, very difficult. But we make a lot of progress, and we can see that a lot of these water bodies actually have achieved a pretty good status.
So would you say, I assume not, but would you say that it will be possible to achieve the goal number 6 until 2030, or do you think we will need more time? And if so, why, and like how much time do you think will be needed?
I don't think it will be achieved in that way globally. Of course, there's going to be places where we don't achieve them. What we probably going to see is that we make progress, because at least water is very a hot topic at the moment. I think I looked at Sweden did actually kind of this measurement in 2017, I think, and many of us think that, oh, Sweden is a developed country, we're good at all of these things. I think we had reached 20% of the indicators by that time. So to make up this 80% to reach the sustainable development goals, we're not going to reach them all.
I see. Another question is like, how do we ensure that we can sustain a certain level of water quality when it has been reached, and like not fall back into lower levels of quality?
Well, these cycles that they have, these 6-year cycles, that's going to go on forever. And what you have to do then is in the action plan, actually make sure that we stay in good status. So it's not that when we actually reach good status, then we're going to just release and be happy. But each and every 6-year cycle, well, we look at the quality now, we set new targets, and then make sure that we keep this good status. And as we said, there's a non-deterioration principle, which means that you can't go from good to moderate status without the commission coming in and yelling at you.
And telling you no, yeah. Another question is, you were discussing the different EU legislations, and the different directives that regards water usage and pollution, but also there is a big part of pollution that regards to like created by Asia and America and other continents. Like, how could we address those polluters, and like what can we do to actually achieve these goals?
Well, we actually work on this in different ways, and globally there's of course discussions on this, and what we do here is kind of these sustainable development goals. That's as hard as we get on this. But what we do is regionally, for the Baltic Sea, for example, we have each and every one of the countries be in this, what we call HELCOM. For the Atlantic Sea, we have the OSPAR, and there we work on monitoring to have same kind of what is best available technique for this kind of polluting activities. So we work together regionally, and the EU is also a member of both HELCOM and OSPAR, so they have a big role in this as well. So there we have this regional cooperation, because I think sometimes different countries are projected as villains. They're not villains. They want to work together on this as well. But as we noted earlier as well, we have different kinds of responsibilities. Developing countries can't have the same responsibilities to the world status as it is today, since they haven't been with us to create it. We have taken their resources. So we have a differing responsibility to this issue, and that is important to have with us. We are in different stages of development.
Of course. And I guess that also connects to another question we have received here, like regarding if you know, because you've been discussing the different EU legislations, and also if you know about any other regional treaties that regards water that goes between different states.
Well, for us in Europe, I know HELCOM and OSPAR, and then we also have different kinds of dealings between countries. I know Finland and Norway, for example, have a river plan together. And that is also a part of the Water Framework Directive, that if you have rivers that go between countries, they have to cooperate and put up these plans together. So there are a lot of different small treaties based on the water body. So if it's a marine water body, well, then it's going to be a lot of countries. If it's a river, then it's probably going to be a few countries, but they have to work together. They can't have different kinds of measurements and actions to work. They have to have the same.
And then for the last question, like if the sustainable development goals actually make sense, if we keep making new deadlines, first 2015, then 2027, then 2039, like will we ever reach the goals if we continue like this? What is your opinion on these matters?
Well, 2030 is the SDGs. So the different deadlines for EU, that was decided from the beginning, because this came in 2000 and then they implemented it, and they said that 2015, that is kind of the first year that we can actually demand that some of the water bodies have good status. This is man-made pollution for hundreds of years, and we can't reverse that in 10, 15 years. So already from the beginning, they said 2027, that's going to be the date for some of them. So if there's going to be more deadlines, probably not. The objective states that, well, countries have to do what we reasonably can ask for them. So some of the water bodies are not going to reach good status, and that is probably because they are so polluted that we can't actually demand that they do that, but they have to take reasonable action to make sure that they make progress and hopefully reach it by some year.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much for your lecture, Jonas, and answering all these questions. I see it's like people have been very interested in getting to know more. So once again, ELSA Sweden would like to thank you, and also ELSA Germany, for inviting us and speaking on this, and for you accepting our invitation. And I guess we'll now hand over to Sophie and ELSA Germany.
Thank you so much, both of you.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the quick segue back to ELSA Germany too. It's been really, really interesting listening to you talk, and also Erica, thank you for moderating the questions. I think we definitely had some great ones. So I guess we absolutely used the 1 hour that we had. Thank you very, very much for organizing the event. Also to ELSA Sweden and Jonas for your time this morning.